And we're live.
Hi, we are live
Hi.
again. Hi, hello, and welcome to the Gen Blend.
Welcome back.
I am Sophie Wade. I'm a workforce innovation specialist, and I focus on upskilling leaders to adapt to modern work and grow thriving multi-generational distributed teams.
And I'm Danielle Farage, Gen Z speaker and talent strategist, helping bridge gaps between Gen Z and older generations through learning and authentic connection.
This is our monthly live video series.
Where we basically explore and work through multi-generational issues at work.
And it's our 5th episode this month.
How exciting. And our topic this week is whose problem is my mental health? Big one.
Right. And so let's jump into the first segment, which is our Fast 4 News segment. We have 4 stories as always, and the first one is a recent survey that was done by intelligent.com. Gen Z New Yorkers are hitting back. They say they're not lazy, they're just more creative than boomers and Gen Xers. Okay. And this is from the indication that many employers perceive Gen Z employees as lacking work ethic and being unprepared, leading to early terminations. New York Gen Zs, that's you, Danielle, contest this view, emphasizing their commitment to work-life balance and innovative approaches. A 27-year-old freelance designer asserts that her generation is redefining traditional work structures, valuing flexibility and creativity over conventional corporate norms, which reflects a broader Gen Z trend about prioritizing personal well-being and integrating diverse interests into their professional lives. So I will say that just overall, I do appreciate a different interpretation of work and a new attitude and approach to work just generally that all generations I think can benefit from, because I know that the crazy long work hours, the working in the evenings, the working on the weekends, which our European counterparts do not do, and yet their countries remain competitive on the world stage. How do you feel in comparison to what's being said about you?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a few differences that stand out to me about specifically the how of work that I think this article is hinting at, that Gen Z does differently. And for starters, Gen Z not only knows that there's often multiple ways to do something, but many of us were forced during the pandemic to do it a different way, whether it be learning, whether it be earning, whether it be working. And therefore, we were forced to experiment at an earlier age and question the how of how we do things from the outset.
Fair enough. And those learnings are maybe not being so well received now that everyone's supposed to be back to normal, working in our sort of previous norms. But yeah, modern work is very different. And it is different from what old generations are used to. So I do see that the way that Gen Z is approaching work in different ways can bring new perspectives that are beneficial to trying to understand this new workplace.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I do think that the standard of what people know coming into the workforce has also changed really drastically. While we see more organizations valuing new ideas more than before, probably, we also see them place more value on things like years of experience, which really heightens the barrier to entry for a lot of people.
Right.
Plus, I think about cost of living versus entry level salaries being very different, which also has led to many Gen Zers needing to get creative with how they create income. And I think all these factors, contribute to what I consider a very creative generation, in my humble opinion. But who's to say I'm right, right? But I think that leads us into our next story of the week, which is about how South Korea starts to raise the game on workplace mental health. We'll see what that actually means in a second. But the article highlights how South Korea's evolving workplace culture focusing on mental health and employee well-being is is shifting. Historically, companies in South Korea have faced public scrutiny for their crunch mode environments, excessive overtime, workplace bullying,
Mm,
and in many cases, these things have led to tragic outcomes like death. In response, major corporations have introduced reforms like healthcare centers, mental health counseling, and changes to the wage systems, as well as some
mm,
government interventions, which includes a limiting the 52-hour work week to 52
mm.
hours and enacting anti-bullying laws, which also aim to improve conditions. In my opinion, I think these interventions are kind of a joke. I mean, in the States, we have the typical 40-hour work week, but obviously people work more than that. So who's to say that this 52-hour rule will actually be enforced? That's just like my biggest question around this. What do you
Mm.
think?
Well, I will say that in South Korea and in Japan, there are in both languages is a verb which is to work yourself to death. So culturally there has been this emphasis on working very very hard to extraordinary ends. So I do see that the limitation of looking at a 52-hour work week, that's a huge improvement. It is a long way away from the 32-hour average week that you have in the Netherlands and other countries in Europe. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And when we're thinking about the tight labor market that is the case globally, South Korea also, they have a aging population, that they are needing to pay attention and have a much more employee-centric approach and be sort of thinking about how people can work effectively and not be burned out and not be suffering from mental health issues. So I think this is an important shift. It's a cultural shift, really, based on sort of what has been the norm in the past.
Right. And I think to your point, this could potentially be what the United States is looking towards in our future. We might need to
Yeah.
take mental health more seriously. I think we really do, in my opinion, now, and be more proactive. But to your point, I think there needs to be a major shift, not just a small one that makes little to no dent in what's expected, both
Mhm.
of companies and of people they employ. Right. And if you're really serious about mental health, maybe we'd see more robust mental health programming, involving people in the conversation about what they actually need,
Right.
things like that.
Yeah, because this shift takes everybody being involved, and I think when it is a cultural shift, if we're helping people participate, be setting the example, then you can make that shift more faster. And this new development is visible. It is a legal sort of stake in the ground. So hopefully that will change the dynamics overall as people start participating and have
Yeah.
legal ramifications as
We will
well.
definitely be following this. But that brings us to our next story, which is a very interesting one. We're talking
Yeah.
about the soft skills crisis. So, 1 in 4
Mm.
executives, 1 in 4, that's 25%, wouldn't even
Yeah.
think of hiring an entry level Gen Z grad. So, fewer than half
Okay.
of workers, just 48%, and just 12% of mid level executives think that today's entry level workers are adequately prepared for the workforce, according to a General Assembly report. The biggest
Mhm.
drivers are that new entrants don't have the soft skills like communication, collaboration, adaptability needed to thrive at work. Wow.
Well, so empathy is one of those critical soft skills, and I really do see that as being so important. But how do you react to this? I mean, part of it for me is who is responsible if Gen Zs are not ready when they come into the workplace. Who is responsible for preparing them? I mean, is it the schools? Is it college? Is it who is it? Parents? I do sort of get a sense that executives and managers are blaming younger employees when they're coming in and they're not prepared. So what are your friends saying? And in terms of when they were coming into the workplace after the pandemic and trying to make adjustments, what was their reception like?
Well, this is definitely something that's come up in my meetings with clients and people development leaders, as well as conversations amongst my peers. I think this
Mm,
generation, we missed out on at least 3 years of critical in-person time where we would have
Mm,
been able to learn and have people model the behavior that's expected. And it's
right.
most obvious in my opinion in the soft skills, right? Which relates to
Mm,
an earlier Gen Blend episode that we covered about professionalism and
yeah.
this generation not really understanding the value of it. We graduated into a time of the sweatpants were the way to go, and so
Yep.
realistically professionalism hasn't really been explained to us, and it's not just impacting the way that we show up in the interview or in the first 6 months, but it's also impacting Gen Z's ability to level up and grow at companies. And in my opinion, the smart organizations, the ones that I'm talking to, are recognizing the problem and
Yeah.
tackling it head on via things like early development programming.
I think it's such a great point about the if you're not bringing people in and helping them grow right then, because it's the complexity of work is changing so much, and that's only going to increase with AI. It's already been much more advanced than it has for previous generations, and managers often aren't necessarily so aware of that. And so when the people are coming in, the easy stuff is being automated away. They really need to be prepared, to be upskilled, to be up leveled, to be ready for the work that they're facing right away, and be sort of supported in that transition. So having those immediate sort of development sort of training and support and upskilling is going to be increasingly important as we move forward. Okay, so that gets us to actually a nice segue to our fourth and final news article, which is from Euronews. A recent report found companies are dissatisfied with Gen Z new hires and may avoid hiring recent graduates in the future. It doesn't even talk about what skills they have. Gen Z is entering a workforce that isn't fully prepared for them. Many recent graduates face complaints about how they fit into the workplace, and employers report increasing frequency and hesitancy hiring them. So, I was talking to actually a couple of older millennials just recently who had the same view about Gen Zs. And this is a recurring issue. It's showing up in many different ways. But not hiring Gen Zs, I mean, yes, this entry level work is more complex and it is going to increase with AI. But what are the different ways to deal with this? Is it having the managers better acclimate the Gen Zs? It's the upskilling, or are we thinking about that entry level work is no longer appropriate for or sort of matching the skills of graduates with little or no work experience? So how do we deal with that? So I think this is a big issue that we're coming up against, and I think it's to do with the technology skills, with the automation, but we need to have a way of dealing with this. But it doesn't seem to be the clarity across the generations about what the issue is.
I agree, and what I don't really understand about avoiding hiring college grads is the short-sighted thinking. It's like saying, I'm not going to water my tree because I don't like the fruit that it bore this year, when in
Right.
reality, that tree will only continue to produce fruit that's less than ideal if you don't water it, or it will
Yeah.
die, right? And in the same vein, if you invest in great soil and you nourish the seedling until it becomes a fruitful tree, the results that you get will be much better. And so I say that to say, investing in the next generation through early development programming, high school outreach
Yeah.
programs, early, like the even personal finance education, like teaching us things that are actually valuable to us
Mm-hmm.
will get them to buy into your brand early enough that they feel indebted and like you've provided real value, and therefore they want to be loyal to you, or they want to really invest and they want to grow internally at your company. So I think it's really about this like longer term thinking. Otherwise, you're going
Sure.
to end up with little to no one to hire.
And I think that also can be working with colleges and schools to help that transition be better. I mean, there are lots of different ways of dealing with it, which aren't necessarily all borne by the corporation. I think we need to be thinking about in the lifelong learning, in the way that education and the skills that we're needing in the workplace, particularly in the early years, we need to be rethinking this to suit all generations.
Definitely. All right, that brings us to our blender bender of the week, which is whose problem is my mental health? So we have a lot to get to. If you have questions that have come up for you, pop them in the chat. We will get to them later. Our first question, bigger question around mental health is how much is mental health actually costing us?
Mm. Right. Okay. So the numbers are pretty daunting. WHO, the World Health Organization, and the World Economic Forum estimate that mental health conditions cost the global economy around $1 trillion a year in
Wow.
lost productivity, both direct cost treatment and indirect costs, lost work, and reduced productivity, disability. In the US, mental health costs are significant. Over $225 billion in direct healthcare cost. Lost earnings and productivity cost almost $200 billion annually. And when it comes to the company level, companies spend 2 to 3 times more on healthcare for employees with mental health conditions. And employees with untreated mental health conditions lose an average of 27, or they take an average of about 27 work days annually. Also, and this is something I wasn't aware of to this degree, mental health is the leading cause of turnover, with replacement costs we know cost between 50 and 200% of annual salary. So leading cause of turnover, that's a new one to me.
I've never heard that either. That's pretty wild. According to the NIH, also some interesting stats are that 44% of Gen Z is diagnosed with a mental health condition. 70% report anxiety and depression symptoms. They're also the most likely generation to report having a negative impact on mental health at 91%, which is a huge number.
Okay.
They also have the highest rates of burnout, and lastly, they're most likely to leave their jobs due to mental health at 75%.
Oh, 75. Okay. Well, the numbers aren't great for any of the other generations either. We'll just run through those quickly. Diagnosed with mental health conditions, 35% of millennials, 31% of Xers, and 22% of boomers. So it doesn't go below a fifth of any generation. Anxiety and depression, that's 54% of millennials, 40% of Gen X, and 32% of boomers, so still a third. Reporting workplace stress, these numbers are really bad. 59% of millennials, 54% of Gen X, and 48% of boomers. So around half of all workers plus are reporting mental workplace stress. And lastly, around 50% of millennials have left jobs partly due to mental health, and a third of Gen X. So we've got some serious issues here.
Yeah. So let's dig in. So where do many of the mental health issues come from? So I think one of the places are what are the different generations' expectations or beliefs about what they need to be earning to be successful or comfortable. Recently, I think this week everyone is talking about this report. There was a study that was done on what different generations believe someone would need to earn to be considered financially successful. Gen Z said nearly $600,000 a year in a salary, while no other generation even said half that amount. So what's interesting about this is, one of the comments, I mean, you could go and read the comments on the post. I can link it below, but one of the comments was talking about a career readiness program. It was an assistant professor that's creating a BA in wellbeing. And she said that one of the problems and one of the things that this kind of BA and program will address is helping to level set the expectations and set realistic goals for Gen Zers in terms of what their financial outlook and maybe their professional outlook will be and what they could expect. Because I think one of the problems is that their expectations are so far from what could actually happen in reality.
Right. And it's interesting to me. I mean, again, it goes back to what we were talking about previously about who is preparing Gen Zs for the workplace and for what they can be anticipating realistically going ahead. And if those expectations are not managed, then obviously that's not going to lead to, it's going to lead to frustrations and dissatisfaction, as well as mental health issues. And maybe it was just different because in the past, the companies took care of you, and you didn't sort of have to be, sort of, you knew there was a trajectory, that it was much more determined, and there weren't so much volatility, as well as less job security, more job security. But what do you think of, why are Gen Z's expectations so much higher than other generations?
Well, I briefly touch on this in my post, which is that, Gen Z graduated during the height of COVID. We saw record
Yeah.
inflation. We quickly learned that no job is secure, right? One of the worst job markets since 2008. We watched the likelihood of owning a home in the next 5 to 10 years nearly vanish. And we also
Right.
are maturing and have matured during a social media boom where suddenly people could showcase their wealth online for the entire world to
Mm.
see. And we don't
Yeah.
actually know if that wealth is genuine or not. And not
Yeah.
to mention, who's teaching Gen Z about personal finance? Based on all these factors, right? This number to me actually makes a lot of sense. But the problem again is that we're not level setting these expectations. And my recommendation, like I said in the post, is that we have more authentic conversations both at home, maybe even at work, about finances, cost of living, how to manage
Mhm.
expectations around finances, because I think it really can impact our ability to even be happy, right? When we're not making $600,000 a year, and really just enjoying the journey of getting to a certain goal, I think is the most crucial skill that one person can learn.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about this. I think, it's about a quarter of Gen Zs don't ever expect to be able to retire. So I think maybe that's why they're pushing the number up, so that they actually have the ability to save for the future. And maybe in the past, because pensions were taken care of, because you had a job for life, you didn't have to be thinking about now, so early on, you're trying to project way into the future what I might be earning then, because it was so much more stable. But I think, what's interesting to me in some of the comments, there was how can these young people be having such unrealistic expectations, like it was inappropriate for that, versus some understanding of kind of like, well, this is not a healthy way of trying to anticipate what I might be able to earn, because I'm trying to create a more stable future for myself. So I think having some conversations, as you're saying, about this, to be sharing. I mean, the good news is I do know there are lots of organizations that do try and educate a lot of give employees sort of financial lunch and learns, and give them some more sort of financial health plan, financial wealth planning support. So I think that is very helpful. But I think this is an area that we can really do some level setting, as you're saying, so that people can be managing the expectations. And because finance, people's financial stability is so important, particularly for younger employees, that this could be really helpful in managing mental health situations.
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
going to our second question, Danielle, how should you deal with someone oversharing at work? And I love this question because you shared a story with me about some oversharing, which became an issue.
Yeah, and it's funny because typically we hear about, oh, the younger generation doesn't have boundaries or know when to share things or not to share things. Well, I actually heard an opposite story from a friend of mine whose manager showed up to a meeting and started oversharing about their love life. Now, this friend of mine did not know how to handle it, and I honestly
Mm.
didn't know what to tell her, because in that example, it becomes really uncomfortable for the managee to sit with what's been shared. They're also unlikely to go to HR because, fear of retribution or breaking trust with the manager. So I don't know. What would you say about this situation?
Honestly, it is hard. It's much easier as the manager to say, "Hey, great, thanks." But if you're the person if you're the team member, to cut someone off can sound, not empathetic, can sound rude. So it's a difficult situation to be in. And I think managers, there's so much that is on managers' plate now. They are being expected to be supporting their team's mental health, be trying to manage emotional aspects of people's lives as well as their work. And a lot of them are not prepared for it, not trained for it. And this is what is so important, to be helping understand what the support level needs to be. And I'm sorry. This is a dog situation which I just have to deal with right now. This is the future of work. So just please pick up the dog and take him outside. Okay, sorry about that. These things happen. So yes, this is a live show. What can I tell you? So I think trying to connect with team members who are on is so important, having those trusting relationships, having those bonds, and yet maintaining boundaries. So I think this is some of the challenge that we're all dealing with. As you said, yes, Gen Zs are challenged with creating boundaries between work and the end of the day, but also when it comes to mental health and sharing and other situations. I think this is something that we really need to put some active training in place.
I agree. And interestingly enough, this morning on the HR morning show, the question of bringing your full self to work came up.
Yeah.
And I think one of the considerations we have to be mindful of is that oversharing can happen up and down, right? And therefore, organizations have a responsibility to really teach everyone how to navigate not only what to do and say when someone shares some sensitive personal information, but also how to course correct and create like more boundaries and systems to support that kind of, confrontation.
Yes, and I've had a lot of discussion about bringing your whole self to work over the last several years, and bringing your whole self does not mean that you have to show all the warts and bumps and and so being more real, being more three-dimensional, not being that sort of two-dimensional cutout, so we can understand each other as real people, but it doesn't mean sharing everything. And also recognizing the difference between sharing a love situation and sharing mental health, and managers being trained and understanding how to deal with with each situation, which requires different sensitivity. There's also what we're used to. I mean, as older generations, we sort of told to push through. It's very much the English, keep calm and carry on type idea. And we aren't very good at, as a Gen X, at self-care. And so that can also change how we think about supporting younger team members and what needs to be, how we help them, how we support them. And if somebody asks for a paid time, PTO, how do we help them? How do we support them and ensure that everybody is also supporting each other's? Because sometimes it can leave other people sort of hanging. You had a situation like that recently too, right?
Yeah. And recently I heard from a manager who often finds herself stuck in the middle, right? She shared that her Gen Z counterpart takes mental health days when she wants, but often doesn't think about the repercussions and impact of taking a random Wednesday off. And the responsibility often falls on her.
Yeah, I was dealing with a similar situation with a number of Gen Z teams, and it was actually quite a sort of psychologically high stress jobs, where there was a lot of stress. There was quite a bit of oversharing as well there too, and a need for different team members to understand that they needed to be sort of filling in for each other, that taking days off to regroup and level set again was important, but they also had to be creating a situation where there were other people who could back them up, and it wasn't just leaving it all to somebody else to fill in and then increasing their stress. So really trying to understand that we're all in this together.
Yeah, definitely. All right, that brings us to question 3, which is poor feedback causing mental health issues?
Well, very recent situation. Yes, it can. They can be small and larger, but a professor in the UK was just giving some feedback to a student at college who really thought she had done, failed, or, practically her thesis, a huge paper. And she was actually distraught for a couple of days until she found out she'd actually been put forward and had been, had achieved entry into a selective program based on her professor's comments and recommendation, where she thought she'd done such a terrible job. So this was very unnecessary situation where somebody was, totally distraught, very, very upset, thinking she was a complete failure for a couple of days, and it was completely not the case. So I think, when we can really need to be training and helping people give productive feedback, because it can be so helpful and also otherwise undermine someone's confidence completely.
Yeah, and I think to your point, constructive feedback can be really challenging, and that's why, you often have to personalize it. And I hear from
Yeah.
some people that their Gen Z and millennial counterparts prefer direct feedback, and from others that they prefer a softer approach. And the reality is
Mm.
everyone is different, and the best way to navigate feedback is first by asking someone how they prefer to receive it and creating those personal working guidelines. It's also good to understand how you yourself like to receive feedback so that you can communicate those guidelines.
And what's interesting about that, I think that I'm not sure that, I now I've learned so much with all my work about empathy, about how I like to receive things. I listen and I watch very carefully to see how someone's receiving it. But I think older generations aren't used to dealing with a lot of feedback. I mean, for years, I had, one annual report, the performance review. It's performative. It was very awkward, very stilted. That wasn't a productive situation to get feedback in. So I think understanding different generations, obviously that's, sweeping statements, but really trying to understand individuals and how they best receive and give feedback, to ensure that it's landing properly, the words, the style, the moment, the location. We talked about that in another episode as well.
Definitely. And I think that you're also hitting on a huge issue, which is that we've typically viewed feedback as very formal, which creates a lot of anxiety for people. And for those graduating college today, some of whom aren't even used to being graded, like Montessori schools, they don't
Mm-hmm.
typically give grades. You're suddenly put in an environment that's super intimidating, super high stakes. Once a year, annual review, like that's wild. And you might not necessarily also have the context to understand what
Right.
exceeding expectations looks like, because it's not being modeled for you. And we need
Yeah.
to start, I think, depressurizing these types of things, like through more consistent, regular feedback.
Yes, and I think this is a very helpful dynamic, that we're moving away from command and control type leadership, as with decentralizing of decision making, making that faster, so responsibility being pushed down and out across organizations. It means we're moving to much more of, less of a commanding and much more of a coaching type of leadership style, which means frequent check-ins, frequent, sort of course corrections. It could be just 15 minutes, maybe every single week. And that's much more helpful as things are changing so fast, to give people feedback, particularly the younger employees. Part of what we were talking about, part of that training and upskilling and understanding, so that they can understand how to, or you can be understanding, what's working, what isn't working, maybe the KPIs maybe need to be changing because of the evolving business conditions and sort of, feedback from customers. So I think the way that we're moving leadership and how people are being managed to be much more sort of iterative coaching is a very positive development on that side.
Definitely. So, speaking of how we're moving and managing, do you think that it's helpful or harmful to have commonly used labels for mental health issues? So, I'll just start. In my
Yep, yep.
experience, this came up in our conversations because I think we often use labels, and there's a big
Mhm.
difference between living as someone who, for example, identifies as anxious versus someone who feels anxious sometimes. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
feel like my generation is very quick to attach ourselves to labels, and those labels
Mm.
can sometimes hurt us more than help us. Because suddenly our life can become all about overcoming my anxiety versus
Mhm.
focusing on living life and focusing on the positive. So, how do you feel about this? Does this resonate? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because I find, I agree, and I also find that something like, having ADHD, that is something where, again, a label that both resonates, and I find that several Gen X friends of mine who have, struggled, succeeded, but struggled at different times, in terms of learning and in terms of whether it was at school or maybe later in the workplace, and now they have an understanding of themselves. Now they sort of, it's not that they're getting stuck. I think getting stuck with a label or maybe hiding behind a label or not using that as intelligence and understanding to be able to move on, as you're saying, to use that to be able to sort of manage it and deal with it. But this has been very helpful for some of them to really recognize what it was that they were dealing with and how to deal with it well now. But it's kind of like, oh, now I get it. So helpful. So last question, whose responsibility is it to cultivate supportive team cultures? And obviously this is relating to mental health situations. For me, I really look at this as being top down and bottom up. I do think that leaders really need to set the example. I really talk a lot about empathetic leadership, and also be encouraging, setting the example and encouraging team members also to, to managers, leaders all the way through the organization, but encouraging team members to be empathetic, to be supportive with each other, because I think that really helps everybody be supporting each other and nourishing and helping the general environment. What do you think?
I personally think that people have to be incentivized to do anything, but I think also to care. But I think that the most powerful and effective way to do that is for leadership to show up and to show that they prioritize mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts with the self. Like I don't think you can get around it. If
Sure.
you personally don't show up and value mental health, then you're not going to your company is not going to show that you value mental health. Like it's in my opinion, it's 51-49, and that leader has to be that 51% to really show up and prioritize their own mental health.
Yes, agreed. And I think there's also an aspect of culture, which a lot of people can't necessarily put a pin on culture and what it means. So I think being very proactive and about articulating what those values are for the team, the company as a whole, but also for a particular team, articulating and being able to live those values. What do you find are the values and other cultural elements that are supportive, particularly for younger employees in the workplace?
I think some of them are, ones that we've touched on even just today: open communication, transparency, empathy,
Mm.
mutual respect, agreeing that no one's time is more valuable or important than anyone else's. And overall, this culture of caring, right? Like not just starting the meeting, but at least taking the time to check in at the beginning.
Completely agree. And obviously, I'm all about empathy. I think there's more research, there's more understanding about empathetic leadership as being important and being for all kinds of reasons, because, not just that because of mental health situations and more mental health problems that we're seeing in the workplace, but also because we're moving so fast, so much is changing. And that I think is a very positive development. I think the respect and transparency, respect down through the organization is not something, and particularly transparency in terms of sharing
Yeah.
data, down to the lower levels of organization. This is not something that certainly boomers and people who are higher levels and Gen Xers are used to. So I think these are certain values that are going to take some time to really be threaded through, and really be understood and shared and cultivated properly. And when they can see the benefits of how those trusting relationships where people feel respected and valued and sharing that information really helps people engage in their work more and have a much more supportive environment generally, which produces a result, I think that will show more and more the benefits of doing that. But I don't think we're there yet.
Agreed. And it's interesting because I recently, being at HR Tech, I actually heard someone say this, that we can learn so much from smaller organizations and startups that are operating
Mhm.
in a really dynamic and trustworthy, transparent, caring way. Having been a part of several startups where I could say that I did feel like an equal, I felt aligned with the company in several different ways. I feel like that's definitely true. So don't be afraid to ask younger companies, smaller companies, what they're doing to engage and work on mental health. And I think that brings us to the end of this episode.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
happy. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you for your comments. Feel free to drop any other questions. And we will be back next month with a surprise guest,
Yes,
which
we
we'll
have a
be announcing soon. I think our date is December 18th, if I'm not mistaken.
We're bringing in a millennial, so we're going to have 3 generations at the table, X, Y, and Z, which is going to be fun. So
Very
look
fun.
forward to
I
seeing you
can't
then.
wait. Well, happy Thanksgiving to you, Sophie,
Yes,
and to
happy
everyone else
Thanksgiving.
as well.
You too.
And
All
we'll
right,
see you here back soon.
take care.